Tikal lies on a band of low limestone rises in the heart of the Petén, the broad forested lowland that fills the north of what is now Guatemala, a country of soft white rock and shallow soils held under a canopy of tall trees that runs unbroken from horizon to horizon. The land here is karst, the limestone dissolved and reshaped over long ages by rain and root, and across this terrain there are no rivers and no lakes near the center. No permanent surface water of any kind within reach of the place, so that the city rose in a country whose first condition was the absence of the thing it most needed. Between the rises, the ground falls away into bajos, the broad seasonal wetlands that flood through the months of rain and dry to cracked gray clay through the months without it. Low basins of heavy soil ringed by the higher and better drained limestone ridges. The settlement gathered onto these ridges, onto the firmer and slightly elevated ground where the rock could be quarried and where the runoff could be gathered and held. And the pattern of the city across the land followed the pattern of the high ground between the swamps, a settlement laid along the dry seams of a wet country. The forest that covers the Petén is tall and closed, a canopy of mahogany and ceiba and sapodilla, and many lesser trees rising 40 meters and more, so dense that the great temples of the center were built to stand above it, their summits clearing the leaves while their bases sat within the green. The air beneath the canopy is warm and close and still, the light filtered and dim, and the country holds a great weight of living things, the howler monkeys and the parrots and the insects whose sound fills the forest from before the dawn, so that the basin the city occupied was never silent and never cold. The year in the Petén turns on water rather than on temperature, the warmth steady through the seasons, and the rainfall divided sharply between a long wet half of the year and a long dry half. From about the middle of the year into the autumn, the rains came heavily, and the bajos filled and the forest dripped, and from the turn of the year into the spring the rain withheld itself, and the swamps hardened, and the streams that the wet had raised fell back to nothing, so that the country gave its water in a flood and then took it away, and a settlement that stayed in one place across the whole year had to hold what the wet months gave against the want of the dry. The soils of the ridges are thin, a shallow cover of dark earth over the white limestone, fertile enough where it gathers in the low ground and quick to wash from the slopes, and the margins of the bajos held heavier and damper soil that the farmers worked along the edges of the swamps. The country gave to the work of clearing and planting a return that fed a great population, the maize and the beans and the squash and the root crops raised across the cleared forest and along the wet margins. But it gave this return only to constant labor, the forest always pressing back on the cleared plots and the thin soil always needing the care that kept it in heart. The rises that the center occupied stand only a little above the bajos around them, a matter of tens of meters. Yet in a country so flat and so wet, this slight elevation set the difference between firm ground and swamp, between a surface that drained and a basin that flooded. The builders read this ground closely, setting their plazas and their temples on the crowns of the rises and leading the rainfall that fell on the high paved ground down into cut reservoirs at the margins, so that the same elevation that kept the center dry also gathered the water the center lived on, the high ground both shelter and catchment. The wider land around the center carried the same pattern outward, a country of ridges and bajos repeating across the lowland, dotted with other centers large and small that rose on their own high ground within their own rings of swamp. Tikal sat among these as one of the greatest, set on an unusually broad spread of high ground, at a point where the bajos drew back and left room for a great gathering of building, and the roots between the centers ran along the dry ridges and across the bajos by raised ways, threading the high ground of one place to the high ground of the next, across the wet country between. The shape of the place can be read in the land before any building is set upon it. The broad limestone rises standing dry above the seasonal swamps, the tall, closed forest holding the warm, still air, the rainfall arriving in a flood and withdrawing into a long drought, the thin soils giving their harvest only to constant work, and the absence of any river setting the holding of water as the first labor of the place. The ground stood ready in its way, the rises offering dry footing and good stone and a surface to gather the rain. And onto this ground, in a country without a river, the builders raised a city whose whole working turned on the water it learned to keep. The center of Tikal was built as a sequence of plastered plazas set on the crowns of the limestone rises and joined to one another by broad raised causeways. The whole worked in the white lime that the builders burned from their own bedrock, so that the heart of the city was a spread of bright paved courts and platforms standing above the dark forest. The plazas were surfaced in hard lime plaster, laid over rubble fill, renewed across the generations, as floor was set over earlier floor, and around and above them rose the platforms and the temple pyramids that gave the place its height. The great temple pyramids of the center are steep masonry mountains of cut limestone, their stepped sides climbing to a small high chamber at the summit, and crowned above the chamber by a roof comb of stacked masonry that raised the silhouette higher still, the tallest of them reaching some 65 meters from its base and clearing the forest canopy by a wide margin. The pyramids were not hollow shrines, but solid masses of fill and facing raised over the tombs of named rulers, and their steep single stairways climbed the front of each in a long straight flight to the chamber at the top, so that the ascent of a temple was a slow, open climb up the face of the rock. Two of the greatest pyramids face one another across the principal plaza of the center, set on the eastern and western sides of a broad paved court, each the funerary monument of a ruler, and each raised to look across the open space at the other, the court between them held by their two great fronts. To the north of this plaza rises a long, low acropolis, built up over many centuries as platform was set over platform, and tomb sealed beneath tomb, a dense stack of construction in which the earliest royal burials of the city lie deep beneath the latest facing, the whole a made hill of accumulated building rather than a single raised form. On the southern side of the great plaza stands a sprawling complex of ranged buildings set on rising terraces, a maze of vaulted rooms and interior courts built up across the generations into a great palace block, the long, low halls of it roofed in the corbelled vault the Maya used in place of the true arch. The corbelled vault, in which each course of stone oversails the one below until the two sides meet at the top, gave the rooms a high, narrow, triangular section and thick, heavy walls, so that the interiors were dim, cool spaces of small floor area within great masses of masonry, and the palace was less a few large rooms than a great number of small ones ranged around its courts. Across the wider center, the builders raised paired pyramids in a form particular to the city and its region, sets of two flat-topped pyramids facing one another east and west across a court, with a row of plain stelae and altars on the north and a small enclosure on the south, raised at intervals to mark the close of the great cycles of the calendar. These twin pyramid groups stood apart from the funerary temples, monuments to the turning of time rather than to any one ruler, and the city held several of them set across its high ground, each a court of its own laid out to the same plan. The causeways that joined the precincts were broad, raised roads of stone and plaster laid across the ground from one group of buildings to another, running over the lower places on built-up embankments, so that the route held its level across the uneven land, and these raised ways tied the scattered high ground of the center into a single connected whole. Along and beneath the paved surfaces, the builders set the channels that led the rainwater, for the same broad plastered expanses that carried the causeways and floored the plazas also gathered the rain and sent it running toward the reservoirs, the architecture of the surface doubling as the catchment of the water system. The masonry throughout was limestone, quarried on the spot from the same rises the city stood on, dressed into facing blocks and set in a mortar and a fill of lime and rubble, and the great quarries that the stone came from became, once emptied, the very reservoirs that held the water, the cutting of the building stone and the making of the catchment a single labor. The faces of the important buildings were finished in mottled lime plaster, the temple summits and the roof combs once carrying great molded and painted figures of rulers and gods, so that the bright fronts the forest now shows as bare gray stone stood once in color and in worked relief. The whole built center, the bright plazas on their rises, the steep temple pyramids clearing the canopy, the long accreted acropolis of the royal dead, the ranged palace halls under their corbelled vaults, the twin pyramid courts of the calendar, and beneath all of it the channels and the reservoirs that governed the rain, made a city raised wholly from its own white rock and shaped to its own country. The pattern of it is still legible across the high ground, the line of the causeways, the facing plazas, the great pyramids on their crowns above the forest, set out as the builders laid them on the limestone rises within the ring of the seasonal swamps. The working morning of Tikal began in the household compounds spread across the ridges around the center, where the great body of the people lived in groups of low buildings set on platforms around small courtyards, the dwellings of pole and thatch raised on stone footings, and ranged so that several households shared a single open court. Before the full light came, the compounds stirred first, the fires laid, and the water set on. The day begun in the cooler dark of the early hours, while the heat of the lowlands still held off, and the sound of the grinding of the morning meal rose across the ridges before the sun cleared the forest. The first work of the morning in many of these courtyards was the grinding of maize. The soaked and softened grain worked on the stone metate, with the long handstone into the dough from which the day's food was made, a labor of the early hours repeated in every compound across the city. The maize had been raised in the cleared plots and along the wet Bejo margins and stored against the dry season, and the morning turned it into the flat breads and the gruels that fed the household. The metates worn into the floors of the compounds, standing now as the plainest record of how the city ate. Water for the morning was drawn from the reservoirs and the household catchments, the great cut basins of the center holding the supply of the public core, while smaller tanks and channels served the outlying compounds. The whole population drinking through the dry season on the rain that the wet season had been made to leave behind. The drawing and the carrying of water was a daily labor in a place that had no river to go to. Every household supplied from a store that the city's works had gathered, and the morning round of the water ran through every compound from the center to the farthest ridge. The fields and the gardens were worked in the cool of the morning. The household plots of maize and beans and squash and root crops set close around the compounds, the larger fields cleared from the forest at a distance, and the damp margins of the bajos planted where the heavier soil held its moisture into the dry. The farmers went out to the plots in the early hours and worked them before the full heat, tending the maize and the intercropped beans that climbed it and the squash that spread beneath. And the kitchen gardens close at hand gave the herbs and the fruit and the lesser crops that filled out the table, so that the morning carried the whole quiet labor of feeding a great population from a thin and demanding soil. The craftsmen of the city were at their work, as the light strengthened, the potters shaping the local clays into the vessels of the household and the finer painted wares of the court, the knappers working the chert of the lowlands into blades and points and the broad bifaces used in the fields and the forest, the carvers and the plasterers at the faces of the great buildings. The obsidian that came from the distant highlands was worked from prepared cores into fine cutting edges. The volcanic glass struck into long thin blades that served the many cuttings of the day, and the morning held the steady industry of a city that made the greater part of what it used from the stone and the clay of its own country and the few prized materials the trade brought in. The center filled as the morning went on, the priests and the officers of the court about their work on the plazas and in the ranged halls of the palace, the business of the dynasty and the calendar, and the gathering of tribute conducted in the bright paved courts beneath the great pyramids. The rulers of Tikal governed a city and a wider country of subject settlements, and the morning of the court was given to the ordering of this rule, the receiving of what the dependent places sent, the keeping of the count of days on which the ritual life turned, the affairs of a state set down in the carved record of its monuments and conducted in the precincts the monuments adorned. The reckoning of time ran beneath the whole morning, for the Maya kept an exact and continuous count of days, the long count that numbered the days from a fixed beginning far in the past, and the priests who held this count governed by it the planting and the ritual and the affairs of the dynasty. The morning of the calendar priest was the reading of the day and its meaning, the keeping of the tables by which the movements of the sun and the moon and the planets were followed, the count maintained without a break across the generations, so that the ordinary morning of the city was set within a framework of time reckoned to the single day. By the middle of the morning, the city was at its full round, the meal ground and eaten in the compounds, the water drawn and carried, the fields tended in the cool and left as the heat rose, the potters and the knappers and the carvers at their work, and the court about the business of the dynasty in the plazas of the center. The settlement spread across its ridges held the whole ordered life of a great lowland city, the labor of the household and the labor of the court running together through the warming hours, and the round held through the heavy heat of the lowland day until the long light of the evening drew the city down again toward its rest. The first material of Tikal was the limestone of the rises the city stood on, the soft white rock that the builders quarried from their own ground and that served them for everything they raised, cut into facing blocks for the temples and the palaces, burned in great quantity into the lime that surfaced the plazas and sealed the reservoirs, broken into the rubble that filled the platforms. The stone was soft enough to be worked with tools of stone and wood, quarried and dressed without metal, and the city consumed it in such quantity that the emptied quarries became the basins of the water system, the same rock serving first as the substance of the building and then as the vessel of the rain. The lime burned from the limestone was a material as important as the stone itself. The rock heated in great fires until it could be slaked into the plaster that the city used without stint, spread over the plaza floors and the causeway surfaces, rendered onto the faces of the buildings, lined into the reservoirs to hold the water, modeled into the great figures that once stood on the temple summits. The burning of lime took a vast quantity of wood. The forest fed into the kilns season upon season, and the bright white surfaces that the lime gave the center were renewed again and again as the old plaster wore, so that the city was forever burning its rock and its forest into the white skin that covered it. The potters of the city worked the local clays into a great range of vessels, the plain wares of the household for cooking and storage and the carrying of water, and the fine painted wares of the court, The polychrome vessels worked with mineral and organic slips and fired to carry scenes of rulers and gods and the glyphs that named them. The finest of these painted pots were made for the court and for the tombs, set with the dead in the chambers beneath the temples, and the styles of their painting and their form changed across the generations in ways the excavators read closely, so that the pottery of the floors and the burials gives one of the surest measures of the passing of time across the long life of the city. The chert of the lowlands was the stone of the everyday cutting edge, a hard flint worked in quantity into the blades and the points, and the broad, heavy bifaces that served the clearing of the forest and the working of the fields and the cutting of the building stone. The knappers of the city turning out the tools the labor of the place consumed. Beyond the ordinary tools, the carvers worked the finest chert and the obsidian into the eccentric forms set in the caches of the temples, intricate shapes of flaked stone with no edge for use, made to be buried in the fill of the platforms as offerings, the same material that armed the field and the quarry shaped also into the things laid down for the gods. The obsidian that the city used came from no nearer than the volcanic highlands far to the south. The green and gray volcanic glass carried in as prepared cores from the sources about the highland valleys and struck at the city into the long, thin blades that gave the sharpest cutting edge the lowland knew. The trade brought the obsidian across a great distance into a country that had none of its own, and the city worked it carefully, the cores struck down to the last usable blade. The spent glass found across the compounds and the workshops as the residue of a material too valuable to waste, a highland stone that the lowland city could not do without and could not make. The jade that the rulers prized above all other stone came likewise from far away, from the sources along the Motagua Valley to the south. The hard green stone carried into the city and worked into the beads and the plaques and the mosaic masks that adorned the living rulers and were laid with them in their tombs. The working of jade with tools of stone and string and abrasive sand was the slowest and most exacting of the crafts, and the green stone, set on the body of the ruler and gathered into the funerary mask, carried among the Maya a weight of meaning beyond its rarity, so that the jade of the tombs is read as much for what it signified as for the distance it had traveled. Beyond the stone and the clay, the city drew on the materials of the forest and the wider country, the wood that built the dwellings and fed the lime kilns and roofed the great halls, the thatch of the compound roofs, the cotton woven into cloth, the marine shell and the stingray spines carried up from both distant coasts for ornament and for the rituals of bloodletting, the feathers of the forest birds gathered for the headdresses of the court. These perishable things have left the ground only in traces, the shell and the spines and the worked bones surviving where the cloth and the wood and the feather have gone. Yet the traces set out a city that drew on its forest and its coasts as fully as on its rock. The whole material life of the city, the white limestone of its building and the lime of its bright surfaces, the painted pottery of its households and its tombs, the chert of its tools and the obsidian of its finest edges, the jade and the shell and the spine carried in from far away, made a fabric drawn partly from the city's own ground and partly from a reach that ran to the highlands and the coasts. What the ground holds, the excavators have measured, the stone and the fired clay and the worked shell enduring in the soil, while the wood and the cloth and the feather have passed, and from what endures the long material life of the lowland city is read across the centuries it stood. Tikal stood within a wide web of exchange that ran across the Maya lowlands and reached beyond them to the highlands and the coasts, a web carried not by wheel or by pack animal, for the lowland Maya had neither, but on the backs of porters along the forest paths, and in canoes along the rivers that ringed the lowland country. The goods moved from center to center across the ridges and the bajos and down the river systems that drained the lowland to the sea, and the city, set on its broad high ground among the routes, drew to itself the materials its own country lacked and sent out what its craftsmen made. The obsidian of the highlands was among the chief things the trade carried in. The volcanic glass moving from the sources about the southern valleys down through the intervening country to the lowland centers, reaching Tikal as prepared cores ready for the striking of blades. With the obsidian came the jade of the Motagua Valley, the green stone the rulers prized, and from the same direction the trade brought the other goods of the highlands, the grinding stones of hard volcanic rock, and the other materials the soft limestone country could not give, so that a steady current ran up from the south into the lowland heart. From the coasts on either side the trade brought the things of the sea, the salt won from the flats of the northern lowland shore, and carried inland to a country that had no other source of it. The marine shell worked into ornament, the stingray spines used in the bloodletting rites of the court, the coral and the shark teeth, and the other things of the reef and the open water. Salt above all was a material the inland city could not do without and could not make, drawn in from the distant coasts along the rivers and the paths, and the carrying of it joined the inland centers to the makers of salt on the far shores in a trade as steady as that in the prized stones. Within the lowland itself, the centers exchanged the products of their own crafts, the fine painted pottery passing between the courts as gifts and as goods, the worked chert of the better sources carried out from the places that quarried it, the cotton and the cloth and the cacao, and the many things of the forest moving along the paths between one center and the next. Cacao in particular held among the Maya a value close to that of money, the beans of it counted out in exchange and drunk by the court as a prized draught, and the moving of cacao and cloth and pottery and worked stone between the lowland centers made a dense inner trade beneath the longer currents that reached the highlands and the coasts. The causeways that ran out from the center and the paths that threaded the wider country carried this trade on foot, the porters moving in file along the raised ways, and the forest tracks with their loads bound to their backs, and the rivers that ringed the lowland carried it by water, the canoes working up and down the great river systems that drained the country to the Gulf and the sea. The position of Tikal on its broad high ground, set among the routes that crossed the central lowland, gave it a command of this movement that was among the sources of its greatness, a city placed where the ways converged and able to draw to itself the current of the trade. The reach of the city ran further still, for the ground holds the marks of a tie to the great city of Teotihuacan in the distant valley of central Mexico, a power far to the north and west, whose forms appear in the architecture and the burials and the carved record of Tikal across a span of its history. In the later 4th century, the monuments record the arrival of influence from that distant power and a turning in the line of the city's rulers, and the building of structures in the central Mexican manner, and the setting of central Mexican forms in the tombs mark a connection that reached across hundreds of leagues. The lowland city joined for a time to a current of exchange and of power that ran far beyond the Maya world. What moved along all these ways was, for the most part, not the bulk staple, but the durable and the prized, for the carrying of heavy food across long distances on the backs of porters gave little return, and the staples were raised by each country for itself. The trade carried rather the things that were rare and light and lasting, the obsidian and the jade and the salt and the shell and the fine pottery and the cacao and the feathers, the goods that the court desired and the country could not make at home, so that the long exchange was above all an exchange among the elites of the centers, the moving of the materials of rank and of ritual across the lowland and beyond. The whole pattern of the trade, the obsidian and the jade drawn up from the highlands, the salt and the shell and the spine carried in from the coasts, the pottery and the cacao and the cloth passing between the lowland courts, the porters on the causeways and the canoes on the rivers, and the long reach to the distant power of central Mexico, set the city within a web that ran far beyond its own country. The ground holds what the trade brought, the highland glass and the Motagua jade and the marine shell lying now in the compounds and the tombs of a city hundreds of leagues from where they were won, the durable record of a reach that the soft limestone country could never have given of itself. The evening of Tikal came as the long light lowered across the Bajos, and the heat of the lowland day began at last to ease, and the round of the city turned from the dispersed labor of the fields and the workshops toward the compounds in the center, the same population that the morning had scattered now drawing back together as the sun went down behind the forest. The farmers came in from the plots as the light softened, the craftsmen left their wheels and their cores, and the smoke of the evening fires rose from the courtyards across the ridges as the day's work was set aside and the day's meal made ready. The maize ground in the morning became the evening meal in the compounds, the breads and the gruels prepared at the fires set in the courtyards, the beans and the squash and the forest greens, and the occasional meat of the hunt or the household animal cooked and set out, the household gathered into its court as the light failed. The same stones that had ground the morning's grain served the evenings, the same fires relit, the same round of the kitchen worked through a second time at the close of the day as it had been at its opening. The repetition of the meal marking the two ends of the day across every compound of the city. The reservoirs that the day's drawing had lowered caught again the last of any runoff as the evening came, and the carrying of water for the night and the morning was done as the light went, the household stores replenished against the dark hours and the day to come. In a country without a river, the water was never far from the mind of the evening. The level of the tanks watched through the dry season as the stored supply fell, the careful drawing measured against the long months until the rains, so that the close of the day in the dry season carried always the quiet reckoning of how much the wet had left and how far it had still to go. The center held the light longest as the evening came on, the great pyramids clearing the canopy and catching the low sun on their high fronts and their roof combs, while the plazas at their feet fell into shade, the bright plastered faces of the temples bright above a settlement already going dim. The court of the dynasty drew toward the close of its day in the ranged halls of the palace and the precincts of the plazas, the affairs of the rule set aside as the light failed, and the great paved courts that the day had filled emptied into the dusk, the high temples holding their brightness over the darkening center. The ritual life of the city was woven through its evenings as through its days, the watching of the sky beginning as the light went and the stars came out over the forest. For the priests who kept the count of days followed also the movements of the heavens, the rising and the setting of the planets, and the turning of the constellations, and the coming of the dark was the beginning of that watching. The orientation of certain buildings of the center to the points where the sun and the planets rose and set joined the architecture to this watching, so that the evening sky read against the fixed lines of the city was itself a part of the keeping of the calendar. The compounds in the dusk were the setting of the household's own observances, the small rituals of the family conducted at the shrines that many of the household groups maintained, the offerings made and the dead of the family remembered, for many compounds buried their dead beneath the floors of their own courts and kept them close. The evening of the ordinary household carried this domestic ritual alongside the labor of the meal and the water. The family gathered in its court at the close of the day, within sight of the buried generations beneath it. The private observance of the compound set beneath the great public ritual of the temples on their rises. The sounds of the evening were the sounds of the forest returning as the labor of the day fell quiet, the howler monkeys calling across the canopy as the light went, the birds settling, the insects rising in the warm dark, the city's own sound of voices and of grinding and of fires giving way to the closing sound of the country around it. The lowland night came warm and close and loud with the forest, no cold in it and no silence, and the city settled into it compound by compound, the fires banked, the courts going quiet, the great center dark but for whatever watching went on upon the temples. By the full dark the city had come to its rest, the evening meal eaten in the compounds and the fires banked, the water drawn for the night, the court withdrawn from the plazas and the great pyramids gone dark above the forest, the household shrines tended, and the watching of the sky begun upon the high places. The same population that the morning had sent out to the fields and the workshops had drawn back into its courts for the night, the two ends of the day folding the city in upon itself, and the settlement spread across its ridges lay quiet under the loud, warm dark of the lowland night, until the grinding of the next morning began again before the light. The ritual life of Tikal was bound above all to the dead rulers of its dynasty and to the great pyramids raised over them. For the temple pyramids of the center were funerary monuments, each a mountain of masonry built up over the vaulted tomb of a named king. The chamber set deep in the platform and the temple raised above it as a marker and a shrine. The greatest of the kings were laid in these chambers with a wealth of jade and painted pottery and shell, and the bones of those sacrificed to accompany them, the tomb sealed and the pyramid raised over it, so that the dead ruler lay at the heart of the monument that honored him and that joined his line to the gods. The long acropolis on the north side of the great plaza held the earliest of these royal burials, built up across many centuries as each generation set its construction over the work of the last and sealed its dead within the growing mass, a made hill in which the tombs of the early rulers lie deep beneath the platforms of the later ones. The excavation of this acropolis has opened chamber after chamber down through the accumulated building, the rulers laid in their painted tombs with their jade and their pottery, the long sequence of the dynasty rayed in the stacked order of the burials, the deepest and earliest at the bottom, and the latest worked into the surface above. The carved stelae and altars set in the plazas of the center were the public record of the ritual life, tall stones raised before the temples and carved with the figures of the rulers in their regalia and with the glyphs that named them and dated their deeds, set up to mark the accessions and the victories, and above all the closing of the great cycles of the calendar. The stelae stood in rows before the pyramids and in the courts of the twin pyramid groups, each fixing in carved stone a moment in the reckoned count of time. And the reading of these monuments has given the dynastic history of the city, the names and the dates of its rulers recovered from the stone they raised to record themselves. The reckoning of time was itself among the deepest of the ritual concerns, for the Maya held the count of days as a sacred order, the long count numbering the days from a fixed beginning far in the past and the round of the ritual calendar turning through its named days in an unbroken cycle, and the closing of the great periods of the count was marked with ceremony and with the raising of monuments. The twin pyramid groups of the center were built to mark these period endings, the great turnings of the calendar observed with the dedication of a new court and the setting of new stelae, so that the architecture of the city grew by the rhythm of the count of days. The bloodletting of the rulers was central to the rites that joined the dynasty to the gods, the kings and the great of the court drawing their own blood in offering with the stingray spines and the worked blades kept for the purpose, the blood given upon the high places and before the monuments as the costliest of the offerings a ruler could make. The marine spines and the worked obsidian found in the tombs and the caches are the instruments of this offering, and the carved monuments show the rite in its performance, the ruler giving blood to feed the gods and to open the way to the ancestors, the body of the king, the channel between the dynasty and the powers it served. The caches buried in the fill of the platforms and beneath the stelae were offerings laid into the fabric of the building itself, deposits of eccentric flints and obsidian, of shell and jade and the bones of sacrifice, set in vessels and buried at the founding and the renewing of the monuments, so that the platforms held within their mass a hidden ritual deposit beneath the visible shrine. The eccentric stones of these caches, flaked into intricate forms with no use but the offering, and the shells and the jades laid with them, were the gifts that consecrated the construction, the building made sacred by what was sealed within it, as much as by what was raised above. The orientation of the great buildings joined the ritual to the movements of the heavens. Certain of the temples and the groups laid out to face the points where the sun rose and set at the turnings of the year, or where the planets stood at their stations, so that the architecture itself marked the order of the sky against which the calendar was kept. The watching of the heavens by the priests who held the count, the following of the sun and the moon and the planet, the Maya reckoned most closely, was set into the very lines of the city. The buildings aligned to the sky they observed, the ritual of time written in the placing of the stone. The whole ritual fabric of the city, the dead rulers in their tombs beneath the pyramids, the long acropolis of the early dynasty, the carved stelae fixing the dynastic deeds in dated stone, the marking of the great cycles of the calendar by the twin pyramid courts, the bloodletting of the rulers and the caches sealed in the platforms, and the alignment of the buildings to the turning sky, made a city in which the ritual and the rule and the reckoning of time were one. The pattern of it is still legible in the ground and the stone, the tombs and the caches and the carved dates returning to study the order by which the city lived, the dynasty and the calendar, and the gods set out in the monuments the rulers raised to hold them. The year at Tikal turned not on the cold and the warmth, for the lowland held its heat through the whole of the year, but on the coming and the going of the rain. The great division of the year into a long wet half and a long dry half that governed everything the city did. From about the middle of the year, the rains came, heavily and often, the clouds building through the afternoons and the water falling in storms that filled the bajos and dripped from the forest and raised the streams the dry season had taken away. And from the turn of the year, the rain withheld itself and the long drought came on. The swamps hardening and the streams failing and the country going still and dry until the rains returned. The wet season was the season of the water that the whole city lived on. The rain that fell on the broad paved plazas and the causeways and the high ground of the center gathered and led along the channels into the cut reservoirs, the great basins filled against the want to come. The works that held the water were the labor of the wet season as much as its gift. The channels cleared to carry the runoff, the catchments watched as the storms filled them, the reservoirs brought up to their full as the rain allowed, so that the season of plenty was also the season of the gathering, the city storing in its rock the water that would carry it through the months of drought. The planting followed the rain, the maize set into the cleared plots as the wet season came on, and the soil took its moisture, the beans and the squash sown with it. The forest plots and the bejo margins worked through the growing season as the rain raised the crop. The cycle of the field was the cycle of the rain, the clearing and the burning done in the dry season, so that the ash lay ready, the planting at the first rains, the tending through the wet, the harvest gathered as the season turned toward the dry, and the stored grain set by in the compounds against the long months when the field gave nothing, so that the work of the year followed the water from the planting to the harvest to the holding of the store. The dry season was the long testing of the city's command of its water, the months from the turn of the year into the spring, when no rain fell, and the bajos hardened to cracked clay, and the reservoirs alone stood between the city and thirst. Through these months, the stored water was drawn down day by day, the level of the great basins falling as the population drank through the drought, the supply measured against the slow return of the rains, and the whole working of the reservoir system, the lining of the basins, and the leading of the channels, and the gathering of the wet season's runoff, was justified in these dry months when the city lived wholly on what it had kept. The dry season was also the season of the building and the cutting and the burning, for the works that the wet would have hindered were done while the ground was firm and the sky was clear, the quarrying of the stone, the burning of the lime, the raising of the platforms, the clearing of the forest for the next season's planting. The labor of construction by which the city grew was set into the dry months when the farming eased and the ground stood dry, so that the seasons divided the year's work, the wet season given to the water and the crop, and the dry season to the building and the clearing. The rhythm of the rain ordering not only the field, but the raising of the city itself. The bajos themselves turned with the season, the broad swamps that ringed the high ground filling through the wet into shallow waters and drying through the dry into hard gray clay, and the margins of these wetlands, where the heavier and damper soil held its moisture longest, were among the most worked of the city's grounds. The farmers read the bajos closely, planting along their edges as the waters fell, drawing on the damp margins into the dry season when the higher plots had given out, so that the seasonal turning of the swamps from water to clay and back set the bounds of a particular and careful agriculture along their edges. The forest, too, kept the season, the trees that held their leaves through the dry, drawing on the deep moisture while the country browned around them, the flush of new growth and the flowering and the fruiting timed to the coming and the going of the rain, the birds and the animals of the canopy moving with the seasons of the forest's plenty. The hunting and the gathering that filled out the city's food followed these turnings. The seasons of the fruit and the seasons of the game rid against the year, so that the forest as much as the field gave its yield by the rhythm of the wet and the dry. The whole life of the city was set within this single great turning of the year between the rain and the drought, the gathering and the storing of the water in the wet, the long living on the store through the dry, the planting at the first rains and the harvest at their close, the building done in the dry months, and the fields worked in the wet, the bajos filling and hardening, and the forest flushing and fruiting by the same rhythm. The reckoning of this turning was among the works of the calendar priests who kept the count of days, the rains awaited and the seasons named, and the city held its place in a country of no rivers by reading and answering the one great motion of its year, the coming and the going of the rain. Across the 9th century, the long order of Tikal began to draw down, not in a single breaking, but in a slow ceasing that the monuments record in the stilling of their own production, for the raising of the carved and dated stelae that had marked the reigns and the period endings slowed through the century and then came to its end. The last of the long count, dates set up at Tikal, falls in the year that the count numbered to the close of the 9th century of the Common Era. A stela raised and dated, and then no successor to it. The unbroken sequence of the carved record that had run for many centuries, closing without continuation. The dynasty's long habit of writing itself in dated stone come quietly to its end. The construction in the center ceased as the monuments fell silent. The raising of new platforms and the renewing of the plaster surfaces and the building of new temples coming to a halt. The last works left unfinished or unrenewed. The bright lime faces that had been redone across the generations now left to weather. The court that had ordered the building and the carving and the count of days no longer did so. The apparatus of the dynasty thinning and then failing, and with it the whole sustaining labor of the center, the burning of the lime and the dressing of the stone and the keeping of the bright surfaces, drew to its close. The population of the center and of the country around it fell away across the generations that followed, the household compounds emptying as the people left or dwindled, the great settlement that had spread across the ridges, thinning to a remnant and then to little, the city that had held a population to be counted in the tens of thousands, going slowly quiet. The emptying was not the work of a single season, but of generations. The compounds falling out of use one and another, the worked ridges returning to the forest, the dense settlement of the high ground dispersing until the place that had been a great city was a place where few remained. The causes of this long drawing down are read by the excavators in many strands woven together rather than in any single stroke, the marks of strain gathering across the later centuries of the city's height. The evidence holds signs of a population grown very large upon a thin and demanding land, of soils worked hard and forests cut far back, of a sequence of severe droughts recorded in the climate of the period that fell upon a country that lived wholly on its stored rain, of warfare among the lowland centers grown more frequent and more destructive in the later years, and the reading of the decline sets these together as the pressures under which the old order failed. The water on which the city had always turned stands near the center of the reading of its end. For a country without rivers, holding its whole supply in cut reservoirs filled by the seasonal rain, lay open to a long failure of that rain as no river country did. And the droughts the climate record holds for the later centuries fell upon the city at the limit of what its land and its water could bear. The system of reservoirs that had carried the city through the ordinary dry seasons across the centuries met in these years a drought beyond the ordinary, and the failure of the rain, set against a population grown to the edge of what the country could feed, is read as among the heaviest of the strains that brought the long order down. The drawing down at Tikal was part of a wider quieting across the southern lowland, for in the same span of the 9th and the early 10th centuries, many of the great centers of the region ceased their building and their carving and emptied of their people, the whole densely settled heart of the lowland thinning together. The pattern was not everywhere the same, some places failing earlier and some later, the centers of the north holding on and even rising as those of the south drew down. Yet across the southern lowland, the same long ceasing ran through one center after another, the raising of monuments stopping and the populations falling away. What remained at Tikal after the emptying was a place visited and remembered rather than inhabited as it had been. The great temples still standing above the forest and known to the people of the wider region. Some return and reuse, leaving its traces in the ruins. The offerings of later folk laid among the monuments of the old dynasty. But the city as a working center of court and craft and dense settlement was no longer there. The forest came back into the plazas and the courts, the trees rooting in the weathering plaster, the reservoirs silting and filling, the bright surfaces going gray and green under the returning canopy. The whole long decline of the city, the stilling of the carved record and the ceasing of the building, the slow emptying of the compounds across the generations, the strands of strain woven through it of a great population on a thin land and a failing rain and a rising warfare, and the wider quieting of the southern lowland of which it was a part, set out an end that was no fall and no stroke but a long ceasing. The city did not fall in a season. It drew down across generations and emptied, the forest closing over the high ground as the people went, the great center returning to the green country it had been raised from, no longer occupied and not yet found again. Tikal stands now as a cleared and studied ruin within a great national park of the Petén forest. The temples raised again into the light above the canopy, their stairways and their summits consolidated against the weathering of the soft stone. The plazas opened, and the causeways traced once more across the ridges that the forest had closed over. The place that had drawn down into the green across the centuries was found again and recovered, the trees cleared from the principal groups, and the buildings steadied and red, so that the center the dynasty raised stands once more as a center to be walked, set within the forest that had taken it back. The recovery of the city has gone on across a long span of work. The early travelers and the later expeditions, clearing and recording the monuments, the great campaigns of excavation opening the Acropolis and the temples and the compounds, the more recent surveys reading the wider settlement across the ridges and the bajos by the new means that see beneath the forest cover. The mapping of the country around the center has shown the city far larger than the cleared core alone. The dense settlement spread across the high ground for a great distance. The fields and the terraces and the reservoirs traced across the land, so that the account of the city has grown from the few great temples to the whole worked landscape that fed and held them. The tombs and the tunnels driven through the pyramids in the work of excavation have returned the buried rulers and their wealth to study. The chambers beneath the temples opened, the jade and the painted pottery and the shell of the burials recovered and read, the long sequence of the dynasty recovered from the stacked order of the dead in the Acropolis. The carved stelae set in the plazas have been read for the dynastic record they hold, the names and the dates of the rulers, recovered from the glyphs, the history of the line that the city wrote in its monuments, returned from the stone by the long labor of those who learned again to read it. The work of holding the site against the forest and the weather goes on without ending, the soft limestone forever shedding under the rain, and the root, the cleared plazas forever pressed upon by the returning canopy, the consolidation of the buildings renewed as the stone fails, the balance kept between the showing of the ruin and the guarding of it. The park that holds the city guards also the forest around it, the great reserve of the Petén in which the ruins stand sheltering the canopy and the creatures of it, so that the place is kept now as both a monument of the old city and a refuge of the living forest, the two preserved together on the high ground above the bajos. What the ground has given, the excavators have measured, the limestone and the fired pottery, and the worked jade and the carved stone, enduring in the soil where the wood and the cloth and the thatch have passed. And from what endures the long life of the city is read across the centuries it stood. The water system traced across the center, the reservoirs and the channels and the catchments, has been read as closely as the temples, the means by which a city without a river held its year of rain, recovered from the cut basins and the leading channels, so that Tikal is studied now as much for how it kept its water as for the great fronts it raised above the forest. The shape of the city is still plain across the high ground, the line of the causeways running from group to group, the great pyramids standing on their rises above the canopy, the plazas opened again to the light, the compounds traced across the ridges, the whole plan set out as the builders laid it on the limestone among the bajos. The worked rock holds its place, the temples and the platforms and the carved stelae standing where they were raised, the stone of the city holding its form across the centuries, while the court and the craft and the dense life that filled it have passed from the high ground into the record of the ground. The site is still there. The city is not. The pyramids clear the canopy, and the plazas hold their plaster, and the reservoirs hold in the rock. But the rulers carved in the stelae, and the people who ground the maize and drew the water and worked the jade, are long gone from the ridges. And what remains is the worked white stone, and the traced waterworks, and the gathered evidence of a city that lived by the holding of its rain and the reckoning of its days, and then slowly emptied as the rain failed, and the order drew down. The high ground keeps the shape of the city in its stone, while the life that filled it has passed into the soil. In the late light of the day, the sun lowers behind the western forest, and the long warm tone of the lowland evening comes across the bajos, the high fronts of the great pyramids, catching the last of the light above the darkening canopy, as they had through all the centuries the city stood, the plazas at their feet falling into the green shade, and the calling of the howler monkeys rising again across the forest with the coming of the dark. The temples stand quiet on their rises above the seasonal swamps, the causeways running empty across the ridges, the carved stelae dark in the failing light before the silent fronts, and the high ground settles into the warm, loud night of the forest as the color goes slowly from the stone. The pattern is still legible.